Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? I just spent a couple of hours hanging out in the shop before work reading some comics that I bought in 2021. I ended up on a work trip in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for 2 weeks, and before I went out there, I was not aware that it was the home of the National Civil War History Museum. So one day after work, I schlepped down there and checked out the gift shop and the exhibits. I was there for about 2 hours, took a whole ton of pictures. Let me know if you want. I can do a slideshow of that and explain what it all is. But then when I hit the gift shop, I thought, okay, I don't want to spend money on a whole bunch of like rinky-dink, just little trinkety stuff. I got a couple of belt buckles and things like that. Then I saw these comic books. These were published by Marvel in, I think, starting in 1998. I don't know how long it ran, but there were just the four of these. The series is called Epic Battles of the Civil War. It covers the first Battle of Bull Run, and then Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg. They do a really good job of condensing the historical details, giving you just what you need in a thin book. The Bull Run battle, for example, it covered everything from the Confederacy attacking at Sumter, and then actually commencing the Marshall campaign. I talked about how optimistic the North was in the very beginning. They only called for a 90-day enlistment for soldiers. They figured that it would be over, and in fact, at the Battle of Bull Run, there were plenty of people that set up picnic baskets to watch it all go down, figuring, okay, we don't get a whole lot of excitement here in the homeland. This will be a quick thing. We can tell our neighbors and our kids about it. Whoopsie. It went on for quite a bit longer than that. So it portrays all of that pretty accurately. The art style, it is a very 90s style of art. You get a little bit more detail in the cover, which, it makes sense that they spend a little bit more time on that, whereas the inside, it tends to look a little bit more flat. Washed out is kind of the wrong term, but I can imagine as an artist getting bored of drawing the same thing 1,000 times for 30 pages. But it's all very clear and it's easy to see what's going on, and they portray it really well. The Shiloh one was of a special interest to me because I just read Shelby Foote's book called Shiloh. And again, like the South had a victory that they weren't expected to get. And something that happened here that also happened in the Bull Run battle. You get a sense of how different the military was back then, especially when it comes to things like emblems and badging and uniforms. It wasn't all one giant, one-size-fits-all stamped army where they all wore the same thing, they all carried the same equipment. You had the Virginia Army, you had the Louisiana Army, you had the Potomac Army, you had these smaller groups. Sometimes they were militias, sometimes they were state affairs that would gather together to fight for one side or the other. Sometimes there were Confederate detachments or allies that had blue uniforms like the North, and they ended up getting fired on by their own side. That's not what happened to Stonewall Jackson. He got shelled by artillery. They knew what he was wearing and all of that, but it happened at a weird time of day. Shiloh is another affair, but it captures all of that. You get the historical details that you need, but I think one of the complications of reading historical war accounts, especially when so much geography and time is involved, is it's hard to really visualize the complexity and how terrain and distance factored into what happened in the actual conflict. These books do have long written introductions. Well, long, they're only about a page long of text, and then some short biographies in the back, but also they offer an epilogue. So you've got this bookend to contextualize what was going on and why this particular battle was significant. It even says in the epilogue for the Shiloh battle that at the time it was the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. By the time the war was over, it would be the 7th, just to give you an idea of how brutal the conflict was and the fighting. Antietam was significant because it was one of two campaigns when the Confederates actively invaded somewhere in the North, and then they got repelled. This, again, it wasn't the biggest conflict, but it was significant because it represented a turning point in the war. It gave the Union a victory over the Confederacy, which up until this point had been repelling them or kicking their butts. And Lincoln needed that in order to kind of take it to the people and also set up the declaration of the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a lot of shuns in there. That was necessary because, as the book explains, without a victory, the Emancipation Proclamation would have been completely toothless. On paper, it only applied to the South, and the South wasn't going to regard it anyway. This entire issue was about rebellion, or at least it was up until this point. But it showed the North what he was willing to fight for and why, and it represented a turning point in the focus of the war. going all the way back to the First Battle of Bull Run, the North only got involved to quash a rebellion. This was a legal issue. Yes, the North was anti-slavery. Yes, the North had all of the industry. And yes, obviously the South was pro-slavery. And this was something that the nation as a whole, or at least the North, wanted to move away from. But the South was not going to go quietly into the night. They didn't have representation at the Chicago Convention. The Republicans chose Lincoln, who was known to have abolitionist views and such, and they viewed that as a threat on their way of life. The United States as a concept back in this time was more of a loose association of states, and the states viewed themselves as like, we are our own little universes, and we associate with you guys under the banner of the United States, but we don't want anybody in New York telling Virginia what to do, et cetera, so we're going to do our own thing. And that mindset has a lot to do with why General Lee, when the time came, defended his native land of Virginia rather than having this sense of unity towards the United States. He really viewed it as he would have been turning his back on his people who were Virginians. This idea of, I'm not from Georgia, I'm from America, that was not a mindset that was as prevalent at the time. People had much more deep and powerful ties to the land of their birth. They didn't move around the way that people do now. That's a concept that I want to explore more in detail when I start reading Shelby Foote's larger narratives about the Civil War. The final book in the series was about Gettysburg. Like Antietam, this was another Confederate incursion into the North, and they had plans to be a little bit more ambitious, and especially to obtain Harrisburg, to grab the center of Pennsylvania where the state capital is. I think the historians who wrote the prologues and the epilogues to these books also do a great job of, again, contextualizing why these particular battles were significant, even if they weren't the largest or the bloodiest. They represent turning points in the pitch of the war, opportunities that either side had to advance to a certain point and change something, but they didn't for whatever reason. It shows the focus of different officers, why George McClellan was an ineffective general for the Union, and how his inactivity and his indecisiveness cost the Union and caused the war to protract. Whereas once Grant got put in charge, even though he was unpopular in a lot of ways, Lincoln himself went to bat for the man, saying, I can't spare him, he actually fights, which was a direct commentary on the leadership style of George McClellan, who was worthless. And also in Gettysburg, that's when George Meade took over for certain operations for the Union, and that changed the way that the Union fought. That changed the type of adversary that General Lee and the Confederates were facing. It was decisions like that that ultimately changed the course of the war. So as far as comic books go, they do what they need to do with the visuals, and I think they represent all of that really well. And it's not one-sided or the other. You're supposed to be taking a 30,000-foot view of history when you're writing about history, and they contextualize all of that perfectly. And then as far as the details, at least to the extent that I know them about battle movements and so forth, it meshes with other historical accounts that I've read about the Civil War. When I went to Harrisburg in 2021, it was about a year after I had, without really planning to, read a couple of biographies about Civil War officers. I've got on the shelf right behind me here Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant, which I need to do a review of more in detail. I could break that down into huge segments. This is a guy who at one point was selling firewood on the corners of St. Louis and ended up becoming the most significant Union officer in the Civil War and later the president. He's also considered to be a controversial figure. Some of his decisions as president didn't pan out. He was also an alcoholic. That I think has been played up to be worse than it is. He was able to finish writing his memoirs shortly before he died of cancer. He had a big fat tumor on his neck because he'd been smoking his entire life. And publishing those memoirs was enough for him to kind of secure financial stability for his family after his death. But after reading that account of Grant, I think Chernow is a fair biographer. I usually say that McCullough, as a biographer, tends to write very, very compelling books, but he's also very friendly to his subjects. Chernow paints a complete and fair picture of Grant and still manages to make him come off as a supremely underrated and one of the best presidents that we've had in the history of this country. I also read S.C. Gwynne's biography of Stonewall Jackson called Rebel Yell, which was just chef's kiss, an incredible book. I'm due to reread it, and I could probably milk a dozen videos out of that alone. Just the life of a man who, even though he was fighting for the Confederacy, which, again, talking about how Antietam changed the tenor of the battle or of the overall conflict of the Civil War, to where the Union wasn't trying to quash a rebellion alone. The Union was fighting to free the slaves. That wasn't something that was a given at the beginning. It happened over the course of the war. Stonewall Jackson was a man who, by the end of the war, was given funerals in the North and the South. Both sides mourned the loss of this man. Imagine such a thing. It boggles the mind in this day and age. A man who inherited slaves, but was not involved in the slave trade, and provided for them financially, gave them educations and such. If you are by chance watching this as the first video ever on the Graham Bradley channel, let me be completely unequivocal in my stance that I am never going to be defending slavery at all. It is completely antithetical to the principle of human liberty on which I stand. Slavery as an institution absolutely had to end, but the conflict of the Civil War was more complicated than just the North saying, free the slaves, the South saying no, the North saying do it, the South saying no, the North saying fine, we'll attack, and you go from there. It is significantly more complex than that, and the nature of the conflict did change over time. I will recommend a final book here by Timothy Ballard called The Lincoln Hypothesis, as he explains the timeline and the influences that led to the change of the conflict over the Civil War. How it was something that on paper the North should have won with that first 90-day enlistment, but after they lost at the Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln then was asking for 3-year enlistments for the men because it was obvious that this wasn't just going to be some simply and quickly resolved thing. Ballard lays all that out in the Lincoln Hypothesis, explaining the personal transformation that Lincoln underwent, which influenced his decision to release the Emancipation Proclamation and turn the war into more than just an effort to quash Southern rebellion and to preserve the Union, but to also critically end the institution of slavery once and for all. In the Antietam book in these comics, I think it's also worth noting that for a while, Europe, specifically Great Britain, was flirting with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy internationally, which would give them some legitimacy that they needed. The main reason why they didn't, so far as it's laid out in here, is that Europe itself either had undergone or was undergoing its own abolitionist movements as far as the institution of slavery was concerned. And while they might have benefited from economic and diplomatic relationship with the Confederacy, they certainly weren't going to do so and muddy their effort to abolish slavery, which is admirable. One final note that I'll mention here, there was a brief page or two that talked about Stand Watie, who was a Confederate brigadier general, and he was the last one to surrender, the last Confederate officer to surrender a month after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. And he also has the distinction of being the highest ranking Cherokee officer in the Civil War on either side. In fact, if I remember correctly, he held a higher office with the Confederacy than any such figure did among the Union. I've got a book on him that I need to reread before I review here. He's a very consequential figure who often gets overlooked because his particular conflict and his reason for joining with the Confederacy was different than that of others who might have enlisted. There were different factions among the Cherokee who had different ideas as to whether they should join the Civil War or whether they should sit it out. Stand Watie's thinking was that he had a better chance of re-securing Cherokee lands in the South if the Confederacy won versus whether if the Union won and the policy of Indian removal would continue. The Trail of Tears, if I'm not mistaken, happened in the 1870s or 80s after the Civil War. So you could understand Stand Watie's thinking for signing up with them. There were also numerous factions of American Indians who were themselves pro-slavery, but that's an issue for another time, and I have to finish reading one more book before I get there. In the end, these were very good books. I highly recommend them if you can get your hands on them. I don't know, maybe your local library would have them. I'm glad that I got them from my own library and I can read them with my kids as they get older. But I think this was a good choice to pick up from the National Civil War History Museum in Harrisburg as far as mementos and souvenirs go. If you've read these, let me know what you think. And as always, subscribe to the channel. Check the links below. You can find my books on Amazon. And you can also find the link, hopefully, to my Give, Send, Go to help replace my brother's car. Until next time, drive safe. See you out there.